Hello, quilters! I'm Debbie Brown, one of the designers of Cutie Patterns. All Cutie Patterns begin with 16 fat-eighths of fabric, plus some background, borders, or whatever fabrics are needed to complete the quilt. This quilt is Bowl of Cherries, and I used Garden Gatherings fabric by Primitive Gatherings for Moda. In this video, I'm going to show you how I machine quilted the Bowl of Cherries Cutie Pattern on my home sewing machine with custom quilting. Quilting on a home sewing machine can be scary, but with some care, it can be fun and turn out great. In between petting my Bowl of Cherries quilt made with Garden Gatherings fabric, I'm trying to get some machine quilting done. Isn't this quilt lovely? I'm just really enjoying the whole vibe of it. I've decided to quilt each of these blocks individually. And the first thing I do when I look at a block is decide, where does the ribbon candy go? And on this block, the ribbon candy goes right in this strip. However, if the ribbon candy goes in this strip, I can do feathers out here. Now, feathers on a straight line are not nearly as fun as feathers on a curve. So what if I curved a line here, ribbon candied in between that new shape that was made, and did feathers on the curve? I think I'd like that a lot. Now, if I ribbon candy up to a line and feather from the line, there's kind of no break. So what if I put two curves here, ribbon candy in between, have an unquilted channel, and then have feathers on the outside? I think that's what I want to do. Now, I am not great at making an excellent curve free motion, so I'm going to quilt against a machine quilting ruler. Now, I love quilting with rulers on my home machine, on my long arm, any machine. I love the accuracy it brings. If you've never quilted with rulers on your home machine, I have an online class at Annie's Catalog. Check the link in the description below. That will tell you everything you need to know about getting started with rulers on your home machine. The short version is you have to have the right foot. So I have a ruler foot that's made for my machine. And you also have to have the right ruler. So I have a ruler that's the right height for this foot for my machine. Not having the right ruler or not having the right foot can cause you to damage your machine, your quilt, yourself. In other words, it's just a bad idea. So check with your machine manufacturer to make sure you have the right foot and the right ruler for your machine. Now, I'm looking for a curve here, and I dug through my supply of rulers, and this is an old Handy Quilter oval ruler, but I could have done a large curve, something like that, a 12-inch circle, just to get this curve going. These blocks are turned. One goes up, one goes across, one goes up, one goes across. So if one goes up, that works great. I can get the ruler in here, and I can get the ruler in here. I have an extended bed on my machine. This is nearly 11 inches. But whenever I go to do the crosswise blocks, I can't do this entire block because there's not enough room for the ruler. I'm going to quilt the up and down blocks up and down, and then I'm going to turn the quilt to do the sideways blocks because I need to have the ruler positioned up and down to make this work. Now, I want my feathers in a certain direction, so I'm going to, all of the up and down feathers are facing this way. They're starting at the bottom and quilting up. So I'm going to start down here at this corner, right here. And I have my ruler. The ruler has ruler grip on it so that the ruler pushes the fabric for me. I can only use one of my Batt Scooters because the other hand is going to be on the ruler. I'm putting the center of the curve on my center line here, and I am putting the curve so it's a 1/4 inch away from this end and a 1/4 inch away from that end, allowing room for my foot to get in so that I can quilt evenly from corner to corner. Holding the ruler with my left hand, sorry about that in the camera, and I am holding the quilt with my right hand, and I'm going to stitch up. I can readjust in the middle to make sure it's going to end a 1/4 inch away from the seam intersection here. And now I'm going to free motion stitch in the ditch over a 1/4 inch. to get my second line. Now I know that it's a 1/4 inch because the back of my foot is on the originally stitched line. And I'm going to put the ruler back again. That's why I had 2 lines marked here. So the first time I held the ruler, it was a 1/4 inch away from that seam, and that allowed the needle to go from seam to seam. Now I'm going to put the ruler on the seam, and the line will be a 1/4 inch above the previous one. I ran out of juice in my arm. Okay, do the rest of it. So I have 2 curves right here. I'm going to trim my thread. I have a tan or beige Konfetti 50 weight cotton thread in the needle. I have a soft tan DecoBob in the bobbin. This quilt uses a lot of thread, so having a thinner bobbin thread will have me change my bobbin fewer times. I'm going to free motion some feathers, and these are going to be feathers that all go all the way to the outside of my block. Except for the first one. Doing a little feather here so I can curve around to make the second one. Now I talk to myself when I stitch feathers. I go up a ski slope, around a circle, and then hold the curve back to the line. That's what I tell myself, and that's what I teach in my online class, Machine Quilted Feathers. Check the description below. Up the ski slope, around the circle, and hold the curve back to the line. So I've finished all of my big feathers. There's just this little tiny space left here. I'm going to put a little teeny feather in there. And this entire side is finished. I now need to match it on the other side. So I'm going, but the first thing I need to do is stitch my spine. So I'm going to stitch in the ditch. I can use a ruler to do this, or I can just kind of sneak over. And I'm going to grab my ruler again. So I'm putting the ruler with the center mark in the center of my block. This ruler has a handy line that goes along my seam line. My right hand is now on the ruler. My left hand is holding the fabric, and I'm going to stitch. There's half. Let me reposition. I'm going to stitch over that 1/4 inch again to get my second curve. And put the ruler right on the edge of the seam, keeping the line in the middle so that my curve is centered. I can now put away the ruler. The rest of the block is done freehand. So I can go do feathers here, except they'll be upside down. These feathers on the right side of the block went from the bottom up, so I can't stitch from the bottom down. But good news, there's ribbon candy that I can stitch from the top to the bottom and not have to cut my thread. So I'm going to move my needle from the top to the bottom by stitching ribbon candy in the middle. Now, when I teach ribbon candy, I start teaching it in straight. Stitching it inside a weird shape is harder, but you can start with a stencil doing the straight, and just elongate your points, elongate your curves. Now what I tell myself when I stitch ribbon candy is go around a half circle, a diagonal line backwards, around a circle, a diagonal line backwards. My needle ends up back at the bottom, and I can stitch feathers on the left half of my block now. They are going to be left and right feathers, but I don't need to match them, so that I might have 12 feathers on one side and 11 on the other, and if you're close enough to count and tell me you noticed a difference when you look at my quilt, I'll give you a sticker. So I'm really not worried about it. I'm just stitching the feathers as they fall. Now that my block's done, I'm going to make a small knot, lift up my needle, lift up my foot, pull the quilt away, foot down, needle up, and pull up my bobbin thread. Now I can cut everything from the top, and my block is done. I love the way this looks. It could look like it's quilted all over, but it's kind of a present for people who get a little closer and look at the quilting. So I've quilted this one going up and down. This one I quilted on a previous path, so this one is sideways. This one is sideways, so it's time to do this one in the up and down position over here. So I'm going to do every block on the right side that's in the up and down position. Then I'm going to rotate the quilt a quarter and do every block that's in the up and down position, then rotate the quilt a quarter, and get all of them done. I'm going to quilt all 30 blocks the same way, and I'll come back and work on the borders. I finished quilting feathers in all 30 of my blocks, and it's time for the inner border. Now, for this 2-inch tan stripe or brown stripe here, I quilted ribbon candy, but not in this stripe. It was in this stripe including some of the rest of the block. But here I'm just going to stitch ribbon candy in the block straight up. I'm very comfortable quilting ribbon candy. If you're not, you can use a stencil. So I can mark this. These are great. I just fold them so I can see where they're going. You can see through them to a large extent. Take a little pounce. And I have my markings. So I can follow those markings and quilt this entire one side. And you can see here I've already quilted this side. I don't quilt the corners of ribbon candy. I quilted this as a rectangle, then I stopped. Now I'm going to quilt this side as a rectangle, and then I'll stop, and I'll turn the quilt, and I'll quilt the next side as a rectangle. So it's really following this line and nothing else. I'm not going to follow the line though, because I've already done the ribbon candy up here, and my ribbon candy is a little skinnier than this stencil. And that'll wipe off, wear off, or wash off. Do all 4 borders the same way. This was my 4th border, so I cut the thread and ended it. Now I'm going to work on the outer border. It's going to take a little prep on this one. I'm going to have to baste the edges. To baste the edge, I just stitch down this outside, but within the last 1/4 inch of the quilt, because that's where I want to stitch the basting. I'm not worried about stitch length because it's going to be covered with the binding. I typically only baste one side at a time because I get bored. And I don't want to have to wrestle the quilt all the way around 4 times to do the basting and then wrestle it around 4 more times to do the border. So I baste it, then stitch the border, baste it, then stitch the border, and turn after each one. Once I've basted the edge, I now have to mark off that last 1/4 inch because I don't want to stitch in it. Now I have some 1/4 inch masking tape that I stitch over it. You could draw a line, you could just watch it and know not to stitch there, but I like having a solid buffer to make sure I don't stitch into my binding because I don't want my binding to cut off whatever my quilting is. And this I typically only do a little at a time because I have a short attention span. The next part is I need to mark some spaces on here. So this quilt is not square, and sometimes quilt math isn't good math. So I have 6 blocks going on one side and 5 blocks going on the other, and I'm going to use that to quilt my border. I have a quilt marker and just a straight edge. It happens to be a quilting ruler. Could be any ruler. I'm going to mark the border in the center of each block, and at the edge of each block. And I might not do this very far. I might do just enough to get started quilting. An approximate is good enough. I'm not going to go crazy over it. If you're seeing extra fullness here, it's because this is quilted and this isn't. When you quilt, it draws up the quilt. Let me make another marking or two. A regular ruler will be easier to work with. So that's a good place to start. Since I stitched feathers inside the blocks, I want to stitch feathers in the border. And a continuous feather border would be great. But again, I can make it work probably, but the math can be hard. So what I'm going to do to keep it simple is I'm going to make one feather, half feathered wreath centered on the dividing line between each block. So there are 6 blocks on this side, there'll be 5 feathers, plus a feather in the corner. And on the side that has 5, there'll be 4 feathers, plus feathers in the corner. Now I'd used this oval ruler, and I put some marking on here so that this will only go halfway up the border, and I like that. It fits well. So here's the center. And I'm going to quilt around here and then stitch my feathers out to the line, the tape, and the line. I marked off the height so I know how tall I want this. I'm going to start stitching the vein down here so that I can stitch my feathers in a clockwise direction. I choose to stitch them in a clockwise direction so I never have to think about what way I'm quilting them. For me, I always quilt them clockwise. It's just a choice. It could have been counterclockwise. So I stitched around the tip of that oval, and I'm going to stitch the same feathers that I stitched on the blocks here, but I'm going to go all the way to the outside of this block that I've made in the border. So I've stitched the outside of the feathers the same way that I did on the block. I now want to stitch the inside of the feathers. I didn't have inside feathers before. I had ribbon candy. So I want to put my needle back at the beginning. So I'm going to stitch in the ditch, but I'm going to use a ruler for this. Now the center line that I used to center where my spine is also used to center the feathers. So I'm going to stitch my feathers, but I'm not going to stitch them further than that halfway line because I need to be able to stitch feathers on the other half as well. It'll make sense once I quilt it. So I'm going to stitch a little feather, a little bigger feather, a little bigger feather, and then I'm going to do a little one and bigger because I need to take up all of this spine out here without much room here for the tips of my feathers. So now that I'm halfway, the rest of the feathers can come in here. I'm going to stitch all my border blocks the same way. So let's see, there's 5 and 5 and 4 and 4, so 18 of these. 17 more of these, and then I only have to worry about the corners. I'm at a corner here, and it's larger than most of the blocks. So I'm going to stitch 3/4 of a circle in it. This is a half circle. That is a good size. So I'm going to stitch a half a circle, then I'm going to turn it and stitch the remaining quarter circle, and then I'm going to stitch 3/4 of a feathered wreath here and on the inside. Right now I'm working with all of the quilt on the table. I have space on my table behind my machine, so it's really nice doing this work without any quilt in my lap at all. One quarter. Two quarters. Three quarters. And now I'm going to stitch feathers the same way, out to the line that I've drawn back here where the other feather meets, out to the tape here, up over to the line that I've drawn. Bring in this ruler for stitching the ditch. And I'm going to stitch the inside of the feather the same way I stitched in the blocks, where I have to stitch short feathers, medium feathers, and long feathers because I have all this space outside on the spine of the feather and not much space on the inside of that wreath. There's my corner block. So I'm going to continue stitching around the borders, doing block by block by block, corner block by block by block, until I'm done. There's a lot of quilting on this quilt. The quilt might not have deserved this much quilting because it didn't take that long to piece this. It's a pretty simple quilt, but I'm really enjoying the process, and isn't that why we quilt anyway? Be sure to like this video and hit the subscribe button. Head on over to debbiebrownquilts.com and subscribe to my newsletter so you won't miss any quilting goodness. Thanks for watching.